Okay, this is section 1 of 4 that we will have for Monday's class, and we're picking up with the Pearl Harbor attack in World War II. So we discussed a little bit about the 6-month time clock that was set off when the United States cut off oil and sales of scrap iron to Japan. They had to decide whether they were going to expand or not, or if they did not expand, they would have to stop their attempt to take over more of China and of the Pacific, or they'd have to come up with some way of getting the materials that the United States was not sending to it anymore. And they had a 6-month supply of most of this in reserve, and so the clock was set in motion, and almost 6 months to the day of when the United States shut down those sales, Pearl Harbor was attacked. Now, we talked a little bit about the fact that the attack itself was very successful, and that's the prior planning bullet points you see there. Why did the U.S. not see it coming? Peacetime attitude. Again, there's all kinds of conspiracy theories about this, including one that claims that Franklin Roosevelt placed the fleet at Pearl Harbor in order to bait the Japanese into attacking so that he could then get into World War II and overcome the isolationist sentiment within the United States. Most historians, and in fact most people who've studied this in any way, believe that that is a fictitious conspiracy theory, and that the truth is that the Japanese attacked in order to knock the United States out of the way so that it could gain the resources that it needed, believing that once they fortified what they did take, and that's what we see here on this particular slide, which becomes known as the Greater East Asian Co-Prosperity Sphere, that when the U.S. did counterattack, they would make it so difficult for the U.S. to take these other locations, or take these locations as they moved towards Japan, that eventually the U.S. would find the casualty numbers so high that it wouldn't be worth pushing it all the way to Japan, and that Japan would get to hold on to most of its empire. There's really no idea within the Japanese nation that they could actually take on the United States and invade it. There's really no strong attempt to invade the United States at all. In fact, very little. You can see up there in the right corner of the sphere of influence that they had that the Aleutian Islands were actually taken, or at least a few of them, during the war, but very few places that were anywhere near the United States were under threat at any time in any real way. So, back to Pearl Harbor itself. Franklin Roosevelt, of course, gives a speech where he says that Sunday, December 7th, 1941 is a day that shall live in infamy, and that the United States declares war on the Empire of Japan. Now, interestingly, and this is a point I think I made the other day, is that Hitler offhandedly then declares war on the U.S. on December 10th, which may have been one of his biggest mistakes, because even after the attack at Pearl Harbor, the United States is still much more focused on Europe than it is on Japan, and it really is something that turns into a kind of a replay of World War I, in that the United States effort in World War II in Europe is one of the major reasons that the Germans fail just as they did in World War I. Although there's no question that the United States and its allies in Europe, the allies in Europe, played a big part. In fact, when we get to the European War, I will mention to you a phrase that most military historians put forward, and that is that the Nazis were defeated by Russian blood and American steel, and that the United States does become the arsenal of democracy that people had always thought it would be, but it's actually Russian manpower and its massive numbers using some American equipment, but also the American effort in the West alongside their British and French allies that defeats the Germans. In any case, Hitler declaring war on the U.S. gave him the opportunity to go after American ships at that point, which were supporting Great Britain and the other allies. But that was a short-sighted action by Germany. It gave the U.S. the opportunity to get involved in the war, and as it says there, this may have been one of the greatest mistakes that Hitler ever made. Japan will continue to have success right after the Pearl Harbor attack, And this map you're looking at now gives you a little bit of an idea about Pearl Harbor. We talked last class period about the things at Pearl Harbor that didn't turn out the way the Japanese would have liked, and that included that the aircraft carriers weren't there and that they did not target our repair facilities and our storage facilities. If they had done that, as well as knocking out our battleship fleet, then it would have taken the United States much longer to rebuild itself and come after Japan. As it is, the U.S. will begin a counterattack in about 6 months, and in fact by June of 1942, the United States will actually be engaged in the battle that will be the turning point in this war and begin the slow and very difficult task of the United States eventually forcing Japan to surrender. But for our purposes, very soon after Pearl Harbor, Japan will attack the Philippines, and they will take those, drive the Americans out, although it will take some time. And when the U.S. is driven out, the commander there, Douglas MacArthur, will state that he shall return, and he does so. But you can see that the Japanese take the area that had oil in it, which was the area of Malaysia and the East Indies, and gets very close to actually invading Australia. They also take the areas of Southeast Asia into Burma, actually into India to some extent, and continue to control the large areas within what is China today. And so they are successful until about June of 1942. Now, what this really leads to is the beginning of this entire episode becoming a true world war. The U.S. will follow a Europe first policy. Our vast majority of our effort will go directly at the European theater, and the Pacific theater and other areas of the world where we're involved will get less support and less of the equipment and manpower. However, the United States will become the arsenal of democracy that, if you think all the way back to Alexander Hamilton had once said that if we ever get everything together and use all our resources, as well as our ability to produce things, that we could become the economic juggernaut that he thought we could be. And in this case, we prove that we become, as historians describe it, the arsenal of democracy. The U.S. will begin to produce massive amounts of war material, and are a big reason that the Allies are able to defeat the Axis powers in World War II. On the home front, we'll talk a little bit about what happens. We'll look at the next slide. I want to mention that included in the home front is the idea that the federal government will quickly organize things with industry so that they can produce weaponry. And in this case, the government will work hand in hand with the leaders of big businesses. And many of these leaders of businesses like Ford, Chrysler, and you name the big business at the time, will actually be employed by the United States government as what are called $1-a-year men. And the idea is that they will sign a contract where they get paid $1 a year to help to run their company in the way that the federal government needs for the war effort. Now, the reason that they didn't need to be paid any more than this was that the federal government will pay these companies large amounts of money in order to produce what we need, and so their companies are making so much money that it's really just a formality for them to sign this contract. However, it's interesting because it's a modernized version of what had happened during World War I, and really shows that when necessary, the government and business can cooperate and move in the same direction. I'll mention Rosie the Riveter as we go to the next slide. I will say that, as we'll see in just a second, the United States will enter the war, although it actually enters it in North Africa that you see here. And we'll see that before the U.S. really even gets into Europe itself, the Russians will have turned the Germans around at Stalingrad in December of 42 and January of 43. You see here where Stalingrad was located. The Germans push into Russia over large swaths of land, and giant Russian armies will surrender. But just as Napoleon had found back in the Napoleonic Wars, Mother Russia is gigantic and has a massive population. And what will ultimately happen is that Germany will be turned around at Stalingrad, and we'll see the slow push by the Soviets back into Germany from the east, while the Americans and their allies will land up here in France and move towards Germany from the west, as we see. Okay, a little bit about the home front, and of course you see women who are working in the factories, and we talked before about how the effort for the war is what really ends the Great Depression, and in fact the U.S. economy begins to explode in growth, and employment goes over 100% as men are in the military and sent overseas in great numbers, and so there's need for more workers to produce the material that's needed, and women actually become part of the workforce, which is how it can become over 100%. Now, there were a few bumps along the way. There were some strikes. There was difficulty with rationing in the United States. But you see here a few of the, you might call them propaganda posters, but really they were pushing the American war effort. And you also see over here in the right corner the production of, for instance, the Jeep, the general purpose vehicle that becomes the icon of World War II. The U.S. produces tens of thousands of these, just as it does everything else. But the interesting thing about all of this is that although there are a few bumps along the way, as I mentioned, the truth is the United States becomes the arsenal of democracy. And Rosie the Riveter, whose image you don't see here, but is similar to the picture you see at the top right, is sort of the image of the idea that we're all in this together and we're all going to work together. A couple of things about this. One is, as we'll see, that a lot of social change comes out of World War II as the need to move people into different positions in society, including women into the workforce, sort of unleashes a genie of change that will take a small amount of time to get going, but we'll see really kind of become a big deal in the 1960s. So a lot of the changes of the 60s that we have, you could trace back to changes that began in World War II. Another interesting point is that the picture of Rosie the Riveter that you're familiar with was a woman who was very iconic, and in fact she just died recently. In fact, last weekend, and she was in her 90s. But the home front is a very important part of the war effort. But unlike other nations in Europe, the United States was not being bombed at the same time, so we were able to kind of keep things together to some extent. One of the things that did occur on the home front that everyone today agrees was a mistake was the fear of Japanese terrorism or Japanese saboteurs going after American war industries and hurting our culture and our nation. And this is a little bit of one of those things that we always have to worry about when war occurs. We've talked about this before, but in this particular case, it was the order signed by Franklin Roosevelt that was called Executive Order 9066, and it took from Washington, Oregon, California for the most part, the people who were either first, second, or even third generation Japanese Americans, took them from their homes, took their property, took their businesses, and put them in a series of camps in usually rural areas of America, and you can see the camps located on that map in the middle, and held them so that they supposedly could not do anything to hurt the United States. Now, this is an event that most people today find to be abhorrent and can't believe that really occurred. You can't call these concentration camps in the sense of Germany. There was no attempt to kill people or anything along those lines, but it did take away their freedom, it did take away their property, and it was something that was so bad that in the 1980s the United States actually paid the descendants or the people who were involved in this reparations as a result of it. Supreme Court actually supported this when it was challenged as well, even though it was obviously unconstitutional. But it's considered one of the stains on the war and our effort that is really something that we can't avoid. But it does show you the fear people will have when we are attacked, which on a smaller scale will be replicated when we're attacked after 9/11. But this is something that most people look at and say Franklin Roosevelt made a huge mistake. Interestingly, a group of young men came from these camps and were put into the military and went and fought in Europe and were some of our best fighters. So the U.S. enters the war in Europe, and we'll see that the first time that we actually get involved as a nation is by landing men in North Africa, where the Germans were located and where the British were fighting them. And we'll pick up with how the U.S. proceeds in the war in Europe on the next segment.